I'm a little short. Okay. The title of my thesis is called Visionary Metamorphosis in the Yogava Sushta, a transpersonal approach to the existential crisis. Now, the main reason I decided on this topic stems from my earlier studies in continental philosophy, specifically existentialism. I found myself constantly gravitating toward those questions of existence that seem to be intertwined with human suffering. But I felt that many of the humanistic approaches given by notable philosophers and psychoanalysts to be lacking in a larger understanding of what it means to be in the world alongside other forms of being, something that I felt was inseparable from the existential realities that perpetuate a crisis. So, what is an existential crisis? I've included a quote here from the widely regarded father of existentialism himself, Soren Kierkegaard, that I believe neatly captures the subjective torment someone may experience. So you could just follow along with me. Quote, just as a physician might say that there very likely is not one single living human being who is completely healthy, so anyone who really knows mankind might say that there is not one single living human being who does not despair a little, who does not secretly harbor an unrest, an inner strife, a disharmony, an anxiety about some possibility in existence, or an anxiety about themselves, so that just as a physician speaks of going around with an illness in the body, they walk around with a sickness, carry around a sickness of the spirit that signals its presence at rare intervals in and through an anxiety they cannot explain. Kierkegaard's quote signals two sides to the crisis. On the one hand, it's a subjective experience, a prolonged state of unexplainable emotional distress, anxiety, dread, or despair, as it relates to certain facts about life and the irrationality of the world. And on the other, it seems to be a timeless, universal phenomenon that tends to manifest organically throughout written history, bringing attention to certain objective realities of existence. According to contemporary psychoanalyst Irvin D. Yalom, the existential crisis is, quote, a conflict that flows from the individual's confrontation with the givens of existence. That is, certain ultimate concerns, certain intrinsic properties that are a part and an inescapable part of the human being's existence in the world. This is a basic psychodynamic process between conscious and unconscious conflicting forces in the psyche, generating certain behavioral outputs. According to Yalom, there are four givens of existence. These are generally conscious forces. First, we have death, whose conflict is one that arises from the tension between death's inevitability and the unconscious desire to continue living. Next, we have isolation. This is the conflict that arises from confronting our fundamental separateness of being and our desire to be part of a larger whole. Next, we have freedom. This is the conflict that arises from realizing the sole responsibility of our lives, that is, confronting the lack of universal structure, also known as chaos or emptiness, and our desire for structure. And lastly, meaninglessness. This is the conflict that arises from recognizing the realities of the former three givens, that on the basis of death, fundamental isolation, and freedom, existence itself is inherently meaningless, and yet we yearn for a life filled with meaning and purpose. The widespread societal and cultural changes of the 19th and early 20th centuries certainly brought attention to the individual's experience of being in the world, as it relates to both the human tragedy and human potential, necessitating the individual experience in a psychotherapeutic setting significantly contributed to the development of existential psychotherapy. An existential approach to psychoanalysis focuses on alleviating psychological distress by specifically unraveling one's unconscious conflicts with the givens of existence. But this approach to alleviating an existential crisis has roots in other areas of Western academia: phenomenology, existentialism, and humanistic psychology. Now, for the sake of time, I will not be going into detail about these three disciplines, but what I do wish to point out is this. The general Western approach to alleviating the existential crisis embraces a humanism, The individual is uplifted through a discovery of self-identity and responsibility to better exercise choice and judgment. While this does address the significance of human will, I believe it further separates the individual self from the larger whole in which we all take part of. In other words, there is a dual understanding of what it means to be in the world, the self in contrast to other living beings, the universe, the cosmos. This, I believe, overemphasizes the crisis as a problem of self-identity with a lowercase s, which may not only undermine the cardinal reality of an existential crisis, but also may just be a symptom of a deeper problem, a lack of knowledge of the universality of being. So I wish to expand this humanistic approach beyond a dualistic identity-focused understanding and beyond an individualist pursuit that disregards the complex whole of other human and non-human beings, namely a transpersonal approach. The term transpersonal refers to experiences where consciousness expands beyond the personal or individual, but they are experiences that nonetheless permeate through the individual. Hence, the experiences we have as an individual self are necessary to the extent that they bring us to an experiential reality beyond that of the ego. A transpersonal approach is not in stark contrast to humanistic and existential approaches, but rather is an extension of them. So my thesis responds to the existential crisis through the transpersonal yoga embedded within the 11th century text, the Yogava, where current therapeutic responses overemphasize self-identity to uplift human agency. The Yoga Vasishta's transpersonal yoga uplifts human agency through a paradigm of phenomenological transformation, ontological emptiness, and dissolution of the ego self that expands one's being in the world in a spiritually meaningful way, a visionary metamorphosis. I present 4 narratives, all of which illustrate overcoming at least one of the 4 existential themes previously discussed, as well as the significance of the mind in formulating our perception of the world. As I go to show, the Yoga Vasishta's emphasis on yatna, paurusha, karma, and meditation are key to attaining living liberation, the state of jivan mukta where selfless action is embodied. So with over 29,000 verses, the Yoga Vasishta, also known as the Mokshapaya, Lagu Yoga Vasishta, Maharamayana, is a compilation of Indian mythological-like narratives infused with captivating metaphorical imagery and poetic wisdom from numerous spiritual traditions. It is primarily an Advaita Vedantic text whose non-dualism is grounded in a mind-only doctrine parallel to the Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism. We have our main narrative between a young Prince Rama and his mentor, the sage Vasishta, with subsequent narratives illustrating Vasishta's yoga, the doctrine to attain Jivan Mukta, and the nature of reality. So our main narrative begins when a young Prince Rama finds himself in an existential crisis. In a state reminiscent of William James's sick soul, he is disgusted with the world and unable to find any will of his own to continue his duties as a prince and warrior. He laments, quote, "What are these worldly pleasures good for, and what means the multiplication on earth? Men are born to die and they die to be born again." He is unable to comprehend the value of life in virtue of death's imminence. He feels himself utterly isolated from the workings of his own mind. On the one hand, he understands that the mind's faculties govern perception and hence reality. But on the other, he realizes that he is not immune from the mind's ignorant tendencies. Knowing this lack of immunity, he lacks freedom. The mind's faulty perceptions have him enslaved, thereby rendering his inability to act in fear of his own ignorance. Given these confrontations, Rama finds the ever-changing complexions of the world to be utterly meaningless. Their impermanence only signifies the source of suffering, attachment. He is thus left with a dilemma: free oneself from the mind's delusions or fast unto death. So over the course of 6 books, that is 4 volumes and numerous narratives, Rama learns from Vasishta that our perception of the world hinges on workings of the mind, that the mind's purification is necessary to understand the importance of remaining active whilst embodied, despite the falsity of material existence. In the second book, Mumukshu Prakarana, Vasishta teaches Rama the temperament of desire, that our desires are typically fueled by the mind's ignorance, caught in the samsaric loop of pleasures and sufferings. It's here that Vasishta explains the crux of his spiritual instruction, the principle perpetuating the following stories, namely, to embrace selfless action, to remain active in the world whilst remaining unattached. This depends on two essential characteristics: self-effort, that is yatna, and creativity, paurusha. Effort is needed to both recognize one's current position spiritually, as well as to maintain a life of selfless action. The term paurusha is the vritti, that is strengthened form, of the Samkhyan term purusha, which we've heard many times tonight already, which generally translates as man or human, but it's used to signify the omnipresent witness consciousness. Paurusha, on the other hand, generally translates as belonging or relating to human, but it's used to signify that creationary force of the witness consciousness, contrary to the non-creative purusha of Samkhya. Creativity is therefore that force of creation arising from awareness of the omnipresent witness consciousness, a force of endless possibility prior to actual manifestation. Having cultivated these, the seeker is ready to perfect three practices: remaining present, ethical behavior, and meditation. All of these are necessary to live a life of selfless action, a life of living liberation, jivanmukta. All creation emerges from the mind, and it is only with the mind's power of yatna and paurusha that one can be free from the mind's delusions and embody a life of liberation. So the first story I'll be going into is with Lebanon. But really quick, I want to go over that the narratives of Lebanon and the next story of Punya and Pavana present Rama and the reader with stark implications to remain active in the world while not bound to such actions or their fruits. These stories are used to both illustrate the impermanent nature of materiality and the significance of one's actions. Within both stories, emphasis is given to how the ignorant mind tricks one into falsely believing that wakeful consciousness, including material nature, is actuality, thereby perpetuating attachment and continual pleasures and sufferings. So the story of King Lebanon illustrates the existential theme of isolation. His life of royalty and comfort unknowingly isolated himself from the horrific realities of his people. Kudos to Indra, the mysterious magician in disguise. Lebanon was cast off into a dream where he lived for nearly 60 years as a low-caste tribesman, enduring the agony of supporting a family in extreme poverty. Having experienced a lifetime of samsaric distress, upon awakening from the dream after a mere 2 hours, Lebanon finds himself in a state of hysteria. His existential crisis arises from the dream, shattering the lines between waking reality and dream reality, the life of the king and the life of a tribesman. Dumbfounded by the dream's realistic feel, he sets out to discover its meaning, and such meaning was discovered when he found the very tribal people of his dream. Overfilled with empathy and compassion for the people he once lived with, Lebanon's sense of self expanded to include those on the edges of society whose lives would have otherwise gone by unnoticed. Lebanon's story portrays how the unconscious fear of isolation can be integrated by working with one's dreams. The story of Punya and Pavana, two brothers who recently lost their parents, illustrates the existential theme of death. Pavana, the younger of the two, finds himself in a state of inconsolable grief, unable to cope with his parents' passing. The elder brother, Punya, explains to him that death is but a faulty notion composed by the ignorance of his mind. Due to Pavana's attachment to this material existence, he is unable to reconcile its true nature of impermanence. By inquiring about the many past life forms of Pavana, Punya alludes to the interconnection between all species of life, calling the action the ecological necessity to cultivate compassion and empathy for all life forms, whilst remaining fundamentally unattached. The story of these two brothers, though short and simple, portrays how the unconscious fear of death can be integrated by inquiring into reincarnation narratives and the interconnections built between them. The story of Vasishta's own liberation, discussed in the final book, Nirvana Prakarana, explicates the final existential theme of freedom. The story is a bit different from the other two in that a crisis is not perpetuating the need for spiritual development. It is rather a liberative experience that occurs from the psychological transformation of cultivating yatna, parusha, karma, and meditation, a feminine breakthrough, if you will. It's here that Vasishta learns Pancha Mahabhuta Dharanas, the meditations on the great elements, from the goddess Kali. The story begins when Vasishta approaches a dark cave and finds a meditative Shiva in for meditation and a dancing shadow emanating from the sleepy creator. The shadow reveals herself to be Shiva's wife, Kali, the energy of creation. As she dances, the manifest world in its entirety emanates from her transient body. Mountains, cities, oceans, deserts, forests born with each movement. And when her movement ceases, the world in its entirety dissolves. Vasishta is enamored by the goddess's power. So she teaches him the elemental meditation so that he also will gain knowledge of her creationary power. Vasishta experiences firsthand that the elements comprise all physical manifestation, and that because he also is a product of them, he too holds the power of creation. Paradoxically, the manifestations of earth, water, fire, and air reveal their inherent emptiness, the fifth element of space. All emerges from the space of consciousness and all return to the space of consciousness, the Chittakash. The existential fear of freedom is thus integrated through this realization of the transient nature of all things, provided by the meditations on the five great elements. Through the numerous narratives of the Yoga Vasishta, we understand the universal sufferings of human existence. Whether such peoples existed or not is beside the point. These stories, especially ones not mentioned tonight, illustrate existential realities that all can relate to on some level. With the cultivation of yatna and parusha, integration of unconscious existential fears is possible and meaning can be found. Where the previously mentioned humanistic and existential approaches focus on fulfilling self-identity, the transpersonal approach of the Yoga Vasishta focuses on realizing self-identity with a capital S. That is, the universality of being and becoming. One may rightfully be concerned that the transpersonal approach overlooks the importance of addressing the personal. However, as the Yoga Vasishta teaches us, the personal is the only way that we can experience or even make sense of the transpersonal, which in turn enables a better understanding of the personal. Furthermore, where spiritual bypassing may also be a concern, the Yoga Vasishta emphasizes the importance of karma and embracing selfless action, essential principles for the Jivan Mukta. Working with dreams, inquiring into rebirth and reincarnation, meditations on the elements, and working with narrative all serve as transpersonal techniques to better understand the impermanence of existence, the power of the mind, and the absolute oneness of being, all leading to a visionary metamorphosis. Thank you.